Here we go. All right. So we'll knock this out, and then you can get on with your lives. If you have any questions, just ask me along the way. But I wanted to talk about imperialism because it's the topic for this week. Right after this, we're jumping into World War I. So already we're moving pretty quickly into the 20th century. Imperialism is important to understand for talking about World War I because it actually plays, even though most of the war takes place in Europe, it is a global war, and eventually these empires get involved in the fracas along the way. So if you have any questions, just unmute and ask. Otherwise, I'll be going pretty quick through this, and I'll also post the original PowerPoint on Blackboard also in case I go too fast. So imperialism. It's something that's been around for quite a while. It's been around since, I'm teaching my Western Civ 1 class, the counterpart to this class. And we talk about empires going back to like 3000 BC, So imperialism is something that's been around since as long as humans have been around. But what it is in its most basic term is a group of territories that's controlled by some foreign nation or foreign state would be a better way of putting it, actually. So, being conquered or controlled or dominated by a foreign entity, that's what it means to be under imperialism. That's what it means to do imperialism. But what happens in the 20th century, the 19th century, the mid-1800s onward, basically, is what's called the new imperialism. And this is when we have basically like 6 or 7 countries, all of them Western countries, and Japan. Japan gets thrown in there as well. These like 7 or so countries dominate the rest of the world through imperialism. It's actually global imperialism. It's like 90% of the continent of Africa gets carved up by 7 or so countries, 6 maybe. And this lasts from about 1870. I would go sooner than that. Historians kind of benchmark it at 1870. I'd go sooner, 1840s probably, to the late 1940s. After World War II, then these empires start falling apart. But for the better part of a century, a small cadre of countries that are modernized before the rest of the world is, seek to dominate the rest of the world. And it's the new imperialism, partly because it is this kind of global phenomenon, but also because it's involving innovations in 3 different areas. The first one is technology. New technology enables Western countries and Japan to dominate lesser developed parts of the world through weapons. Weapons is the most obvious one. When you take a machine gun against a tribe of Zulus with spears, it's not even close. So like advanced transportation, steamships and railroads and all that. So you can, facilitate building an empire, reinforce parts of your empire with troops and supplies and stuff very quickly. And also communications. I won't talk about communications, but we're starting to get the telegraph. Around the time of the American Civil War, we get the innovation of the telegraph. So you're able to send messages instantly using electricity across vast distances. Before the telegraph, messages could only travel as fast as a person could travel, whether by walking or by horse or by ship. Messages had to travel with people, like in the form of letters. And now with telegraphs, it's instant. It's instantaneous communication. And the world has never seen instant communication before. So this revolutionizes the way that we think about information and the way it's communicated. All the way up into the present. I'm doing Zoom with you guys. I don't have to be present in the classroom. I can communicate instantly to you because of electricity. Economics is the second innovation in the new imperialism. Essentially, rabid capitalism is forced on the developing parts of the world by the West. We'll get into that slightly more detail in a second. And then finally, cultural imperialism is one of the lesser known ones. It's not as easy to see. It's not as obvious. It's like marching troops into a place and taking it over. But you can imperialize culturally through spreading one's Western culture and inherently believing that it's better than whatever you come across. Western, white, capitalistic, Christian culture is used as a cudgel to bludgeon other cultures into submission. So to go into slightly more detail with these things, technology, I mentioned the weapons, but technology in all of its forms are deemed as the tools of spreading quote-unquote civilization to the rest of the world. I'm going to just preface this a little bit and say your next analysis paper is having you ask whether or not Western civilization in this time was actually civilized or was it not? If you wanted to make the case that we had an actual civilized society at this time, you could look to the weapons of war, definitely, as evidence, really either for or against this case. But anyway, we get the development of artillery cannons that are able to shoot, they're lobbing shells literally miles away to their targets. So the hand-to-hand, or at least close combat mode of battle that humans have been involved with forever. I mean, we had cannons before this, but they couldn't shoot very far. We had bows and arrows, but they couldn't shoot very far. But now you can kill someone from so far away that you don't even know that you're killing them because of the insane range that artillery has in the modern era. Machine guns. 3 guys in a machine gun nest can mow down literally hundreds of advancing troops. So the weapons technology that comes across the radar of many of these Western nations is terrifying. And it's put to good use it's not put to good use. It's put to good effect. It's proven to have worked effectively. In a case study called the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which is when British soldiers, about 150 British soldiers, fought off 3,000 to 4,000 Zulu warriors in South Africa as the British were setting up their imperial colonies in South Africa. Battle of Rorke's Drift, the British fight the Zulus for about a day and a half using advanced weaponry. And 150 soldiers were able to fend off thousands of enemies and took very few casualties. And it's depicted in this old Michael Caine movie called Zulu. It's a super boring movie. Like, don't watch it. Like, even the battle is super boring. It's so cheesy and it's so stunt. Like, I don't know. It pales in comparison to modern film, but it depicts this battle where British soldiers held off thousands of Zulu warriors using advanced weaponry. So this is a good case study of imperial technology being put to good effect in the colonies. Steamships and railroads. One of the really interesting things about new technology in this sense is, let's take a look at this map of British India. India is huge. It's called the subcontinent of India because it's like literally its own little continent, walled off by the Himalayas and other mountain ranges. It's got literally hundreds of different cultures, subcultures, and languages, stretching from what's now Pakistan all the way to what's now Bangladesh, and everything in between. And so how do you rule over something that's so complex and so broad and just so huge? Well, revolutions in technology enable the British to do this in India. They crisscross the map, as you can see here, with rail lines. They're able to send troops to reinforce spots that are in uprising or revolting or hot spots. They're able to bind the whole subcontinent of India together in trade and imperialism. And this is a very effective way. Before this, before the steamship and the railroads came along, the British controlled the coastline of India, but not the interior. Now they control all of India and all of the riches within India. All, hundreds of millions of people. Even in the 1800s, India was huge, absolutely huge. Speaking of steamships, we've got the development of the Suez Canal. Comes about in the late 1860s, and this allows steamships to cut across the thin, kind of narrow strip between mainland Egypt and the Sinai. The Suez Canal is still used today. It's a very important hub of trade, or a highway of trade. And it makes it so that you don't have to go all the way around the Horn of Africa and the Cape of Africa to get to Asia if you're sailing from the west. You just take a shortcut right through the Middle East. Same thing with the Panama Canal. You cut through Central America instead of having to go all the way around South America to get from ocean to ocean. So these developments drastically reduce the cost and time of travel and trade, and this enables Western empires to be self-sustaining and to reinforce itself and to very quickly move men and materials and goods around very quickly and cheaply. Any questions so far? Am I going too fast? Okay. Just hop in if you have any questions. Economic imperialism. So 19th century capitalism relies pretty heavily on throwing fuel into the literal furnaces of the Industrial Revolution and the Second Industrial Revolution. And that involves resource extraction from other parts of the world. Let's take cotton, for instance. Britain grows its own cotton in Egypt, so it doesn't have to rely on the fickle American South, which sometimes forms a confederacy and breaks away from the United States. But the local indigenous kind of industries of Egypt are hijacked by the British Imperial Project, meaning that Egyptian cotton growers can't just buy, sell, trade with whoever they want. They have to deal with the British, and the British are there to extract as many resources as possible from Indian cotton fields as they humanly can. And that gets shipped back to, the cotton gets shipped back to Britain, which is thrown into the textile factories and then sold back to the Egyptians for a higher price. And so you have this kind of hyper-capitalistic, resource-intensive exploitation cycle that happens, and it's all designed to serve the profit motives of the mother country, right? And it's not just Egypt. This is true in India for like the dyes and spices industry. This is true in parts of Africa for the rubber trade. Belgium comes in and just seizes the Congo and all the rubber trees there, and they just chop down all the rubber trees and send all the rubber back to Europe to make for tires and different things. And so all of this is just designed to reduce the indigenous, like the native industries of these colonies, these territories, to serve the mother country, right? Africans and Asians really have no say in the matter whatsoever. This is not the era of free trade. Cultural imperialism is involving a few different things. It's spreading one's culture and essentially trying to subsume indigenous cultures. This can be done in a religious aspect. The West was constantly sending just fleets of missionaries, whether they're Jesuit Catholics or different Protestant denominations or whatever, out to evangelize Christianity to the rest of the world, with the goal of supplanting indigenous religious traditions. There's also this thing called the civilizing mission, which is an important part of one of the documents that you're reading for this week. Civilizing mission is essentially this idea that the white countries of the world have a moral obligation to save the rest of the world from itself, to save the poor, malnutrid, backward, non-Christian, blacks of sub-Saharan Africa, and make them more civilized, meaning make them more white, through cultural expansion. Ways that you could do this were missionaries. You could do this with capitalism. You could do this with just teaching Western ways to the poor, backward tribes of the developing nations of the world. Here's an advertisement right here for Pear's soap. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. And this idea of the white man's burden, that we have a moral obligation to save the rest of the world from themselves because they're stupid and non-Christian and not white. This is a pervasive idea throughout this period of imperialism. So they're advertising soap as like good hygiene is a way to save the rest of the world from themselves, and make sure that you don't get sick from these awful exotic diseases like malaria, because that if you succumb to that, you lose your own civilized mannerisms. So there's a lot of racial tropes. There's a lot of racist ideas at this point in history about white supremacy. And that is manifested most obviously in the Nazi regime that comes about in the 1930s in Germany. But honestly, most of the West is pretty much white supremacist oriented anyway. Maybe not to the extreme that the Nazis become, but there's this idea of here are the races. There's a hierarchy where the white people are up here and everyone else is below us, right? That's a very blatantly obvious idea that's tossed around and believed in by a lot of people. All right, so to break down a couple examples of new empires or new imperialism, we have to start with the British. Excuse me. They have the largest ever empire in the history of the world, in terms of both territory and population. Larger than the Roman Empire, larger than Alexander the Great, larger than the Mongolian empires. So like all these different territories kind of feed into Britain, and it's said at the time that the sun never sets on the British Empire, meaning it's never the empire wraps around the world in such a way that the sun literally is never setting on the British Empire. It's always daytime in some British territory because it's that big. All the red spots on the map belong to Great Britain in some way, shape, or form. The largest territories in terms of land mass are the white settlement colonies. This is where Britain sent people to go and settle. Canada is a big one. It's the second largest country in the world in terms of land mass. Australia is its own continent. The British go and settle there, displacing the indigenous people of Australia. New Zealand is an example. South Africa is less of a white settler country, because there's tens of millions of different African cultural groups living in South Africa, but nonetheless, it becomes dominated by a white minority. settlers called the Boers, which are actually Dutch in origin, but I'm not going to get into that. There's other colonies as well. There's too many to list here, but the big ones are India. India is the crown jewel in Britain's empire because it just has hundreds of millions of people. Malaysia, Egypt, Rhodesia, which is in Eastern Africa. Much of the Caribbean belongs to Britain, even today. At least it's part of the Commonwealth today. And there's just a ton of colonies, too many to list here. So British Empire is the largest one, including this kind of strip from north to south in Africa, where they dominate about 40% of the African territory. France is in the game as well. They have mostly a North African empire. A lot of it's just sand. But there are some valuable territories like Morocco and like parts of Algeria. I'm trying to think what other North African territories. Sorry, my mind is going blank. There's also some other areas on the map as well. Anything in blue here belongs to France at the height of their empire. So the huge island of Madagascar off of the east coast of Africa. And then what was called Indochina, which is now Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, was dominated by France at one point in time. In fact, we get into Vietnam, the Americans get into Vietnam during the Cold War because the French were kicked out. The Vietnamese kicked out the French during decolonization, and they started to go commie, and that's when the Americans stepped in and were like, no, we can't let this happen. So, but the French did at one point own Vietnam in an imperial way. We also get Germany. Now, Germany, I hate that I'm not going to spend any time on this whatsoever. The story of unification of Germany is actually a really cool one. And so it makes me sad that I don't have really any time to talk about how Germany becomes unified. It's discussed in your book. But anyway, Germany unifies as a country, as like a solid, united, pan-German country for the first time since Charlemagne in 1871. And it's after Prussia, which is the most powerful German state, wins a series of wars against its neighbors, and all of Germany just kind of voluntarily joins with Prussia in political unity as a result of these wars. So anyway, we get the Empire of Germany formed in 1871, where they have the Kaiser. That's the German word for emperor. And they are initially reluctant to obtain overseas colonies. They're like, we just kind of forged our own country. Let the sheets cool a little bit before we, let someone else into the bed. But initially, there's this reluctance to obtain colonies overseas, and they just want to consolidate power at home. But it's believed, and this is another document to read this week. It's believed that one must keep up with the Joneses in the realm of imperialism. For instance, like if Germany doesn't start gobbling up parts of Africa and forming an empire, it's going to fall behind the other civilized white races, the other white nations of the world, and Germany is going to atrophy before really it's even begun to be its own empire, its own country, its own civilization. So Germany acquires the Cameroons, parts of East Africa, really kind of, I hate to put it this way, but the scraps that are left over that like France and Britain don't want, because there's no resources there and very few people. So Germany does acquire some overseas colonies, but it's kind of a token effort to keep people at home happy. We get Italy. Italy also unifies as a new country in 1861, so 10 years before Germany did. That story is also really cool, but it's covered in your book, and so I'm not gonna cover it here. Italy has these aspirations of rebuilding the Roman Empire, which is pretty laughable because, I mean, a lot of the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire, was like, you know, pre-Iron Age tribal areas in France and Britain and Germany. And now all those nations are more advanced than Italy is. So for Italy to kind of dream of rebuilding the Roman Empire is a little silly because you've got competition. You know, like your former Roman imperial territories are now all grown up and they have bigger guns than you do. So, yeah. But what Italy settles for is Libya and parts of East Africa, including Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the last man standing in Africa during the so-called scramble for Africa, when all these imperial nations descended upon the continent and carved it up. Ethiopia is actually, at this point, a pretty modern country. They have muskets and rifles. They have Christianity, and they're actually a modern country, and they kick the butts of the Italian troops. Italy doesn't win this war until like Mussolini comes along.
My not sisters. My girlfriend's mom is from Ethiopia, and this gets brought up like once a week.
Yeah, that the Italians lost.
Yeah, well, how they like to bring up how they're almost Italian, but then they said they kicked the shit out of the Italians.
Yeah, nice. Awesome. That's really cool. Yeah, it's a point of pride. 90% of the continent of Africa was dominated by Europeans, and then there's Ethiopia, and they're like, oh hell no, and then they end up repelling the Italians for decades. So, John, you're unmuted. I can hear your news. Do you have a question? Okay. So anyway, that's Ethiopia. That's Africa. That's eventually we get the succumbing of Ethiopia, but it takes tanks. It takes like literal tanks, to be brought in the 1930s for that to happen. And then they win their independence not too long after that. Anyway, we haven't talked about the United States yet, really, in this class, hardly at all, except at the beginning, dealing with the Enlightenment, the Declaration, the American Revolution. That's about it. That's all we've talked about with the U.S. The U.S. becomes an important player, finally, in the age of imperialism. That's because by the time we're talking about here, we've had a civil war. We've finally ended slavery. Come on, America, get with the times. And we've started to compile this kind of unified nation state that believes in it believes in this thing called manifest destiny. So we see Europe expanding, taking colonies, all this stuff. America has its own ideas of imperialism, and that includes taking over all of the territory from coast to coast, from the Atlantic Ocean, where we started out, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And this idea is called manifest destiny, that Americans should dominate the North American continent from coast to coast. At one point, we had aspirations about invading Canada a few different times, annexing Canada. It never really worked out. But the goal, the immediate goal, is to ignore all the land claims that Native American tribes have, Native American civilizations have to North America, and just bulldoze them, push them aside, or put them on reservations and claim that land for white Christianity. And there's this oil painting that you can see here. It's called Manifest Destiny. And if you look at it, it's pretty staggering. This was a painting that was, I think, in the mid to late 1800s. I can't remember the year. But there's telegraphs being stretched from east to west. There's locomotives coming. There's wagons and lumberjacks and settlers, and they're bringing the light, like the actual light of the eastern seaboard, to the dark places in the West where we still have Indians, and it's kind of a pixelated image, but on the far western side of the far left side of the picture, there's Native Americans fleeing, giving up their land and retreating before the white Christian hosts. And here we have this angel from God. This is destiny manifested in this pure, blonde, white, beautiful woman who symbolizes American civilization. And it's a staggering picture, because it says basically white Christians deserve this land and nobody else does. And this was the belief at the time. Like this is a very popular painting that reinforced the notions that people already have in the US that we deserve this land and we're going to take it. And we're going to bring with us true civilization to the darkened parts of North America. The US government was very heavily encouraging of this westward expansion. And along with technology and people eager for cheap land and all this stuff, there's just a constant flood of Americans and immigrants that just fill up the spaces between the coasts really quickly. We also get an expansionary war of Mexico. This is more in the traditional vein of what we think of as imperialism. There was a very imperialistic war with Mexico in the late 1840s. And it wasn't even a contest, really. I mean, it's a very lopsided event. Mexico had just gone through some internal instabilities. They didn't have much of a standing army. They were under a dictatorship at the time of a crazy guy. And the United States takes almost half of the territory that Mexico owned in North America. Like we stole half their freaking country and turned those into the current states of California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. By this point, Texas had already declared independence from Mexico with the help of the American government. But Texas becomes a state as well, which used to be owned by Mexico. So there's this expansionary war in the 1840s with Mexico, where the Americans essentially imperialized that part of North America. But it doesn't stop there. The United States also expands and takes overseas territories. I would include Alaska in this because it's not connected to the rest of the United States. It was bought peacefully from Russia in 1867. They didn't want anything to do with Alaska at this point. The Russians were like, nah, it's just a bunch of ice. And then a few decades later, they realized that there's a bunch of oil and like natural resources buried underneath. And they're like, dang it. But we bought Alaska for pennies. Essentially, it was one of the best deals we've ever made. So I would consider that imperial expansion. Not to mention Hawaii. Hawaii becomes an American colony once the Hawaiian indigenous queen was overthrown in 1893 by the United States government and the Dole Fruit Company. They don't become a state right away, but they become a protectorate, like a territory of the United States. And then we get the Spanish-American War, which is kind of like, it's in the same vein as the war with Mexico. It was a war kind of fabricated just for the purposes of expansion. And again, it's a very lopsided thing. The American military is heavily modernized compared to the Spanish. The Spanish lose very, very quickly. And the United States conquers the islands of Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. And they all of them, except for Cuba, we end up giving Cuba its independence. In an effort to look like we're not interested in an empire. But we end up keeping all these other places, including the Philippines, which is huge. But we let Cuba be free and dominated it by other means like economics and culture until the Cold War. So yeah, this is the budding American empire that's trying to keep up with the Joneses. I mean, the United States is looking around being like, we got to keep up with Britain and France and even Germany. Like, everyone's building an empire. We got to do that too. Or we're going to be left behind. So there's a lot of overseas and continental expansion by the United States after the Civil War. So the U.S. will become more and more of a player in how we talk about Western civilization, with the building of an empire, with expanding all across the North American continent. The United States is finally worth talking about. But before the Civil War, the United States was behind a lot in terms of, they just mimicked what Europe was doing for the first several decades of the U.S.'s existence. There wasn't really anything original to add to that. But now we're a power. From this point on, we're a global power. And then we got to mention Japan. This is the last slide. The Japanese Empire is not considered part of Western imperialism and Western expansion, but we have to include it because it's the only non-Western country that's really keeping up with the Joneses in that way. Japan was forced to modernize very quickly in the late 1800s. And the reason for this is the United States. The U.S. sent, so start over. Japan was kind of cloistered off from the rest of the world. They had this imperial policy where they said, we are not going to trade with anyone else in the world. We're going to do our own thing. But Americans wanted Japanese markets to sell stuff to them and buy resources and stuff from Japan. American business interests lobbied the U.S. government to send a fleet of warships to Japan, and under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, not the actor, but the admiral, trained the guns of these warships on Japanese ports and said, you either trade with us or we're going to blow you all to hell. And the Japanese were like, yeah, okay. Because they're still running around with samurai swords. They did not really have much in the way of modern technology to defend themselves from this coercive threat. So Japan realizes really quickly, holy crap, we have to modernize. We have to obtain modern weapons. Because if we don't, the Americans and everyone else are just going to walk all over us. And we still did. We signed a bunch of unequal treaties with Japan. But anyway, the Japanese Empire starts expanding really quickly as they acquire firearms, or modern firearms. They had some gunpowder at the time. Modern firearms, steamships, railroads, modern military training, things like that. And they conquer Korea. They invade parts of China, which is even further behind than Japan was at the time in terms of being able to defend itself from foreign threats. There's multiple invasions of China, especially in the region of Manchuria, which is north of Korea. And when World War I comes, Japan has assembled this pretty impressive military and a pretty impressive empire in East Asia and in the South Pacific. So much so that when World War I happens, Japan joins the Allies in fighting against the Germans. And the reason for this is Germany held some territories in China, some ports and stuff that Japan wanted. The port of Kiaochao was one. And so like Japan allies itself with the British, the French, the Americans to fight the Central Powers. But that relationship turned sour because even with Japan being a modern country, one that could go toe-to-toe with Western countries, they defeat Russia. They defeat a Western country in war in 1905. Despite Japanese modernization and strength, they're still treated as a second-rate country by the West. They're not invited to Paris to be part of the peace treaty process after World War I. They're considered they're just Asian, so they don't really know what they're doing. Like they're still, you know, it's still that racial categorization of white people up here, Asians and Africans down here. Like there's still that very racial idea. Like we don't need to care about what the Japanese think or want because they're second class citizens. And so that angers Japan a lot. And that's a big reason of why they join the Axis powers when World War, the sequel, comes around. And that causes a big problem for the United States. But, you know, they can be considered part of this new imperialism because they do catch up really fast and they do hold their own for quite a while. All right. Well, that's it. That's Western imperialism in a nutshell. You guys will be very well positioned to take the quiz now for this week. Any questions? Anything at all? Okay, cool. You guys are good to go. Thanks, Nick. See you later. Let me know if you have any questions with the documents. We've just got a quiz this week. So, yeah, take her easy. I'll see you guys later.